It's a splendid turnout. My name is Hung-in Kim, and I'm a historian of modern Korea and the U.S. military empire in the Asia Pacific at UCLA. And I'm also a core member of the Ending the Korean War teaching collective. And so before our talk today between Christine and Yusef, we want to give you an overview of how this project has developed and what we initially conceived as an objective and how that has taken a trajectory over the years to kind of show you an idea what this initiative is about. But first and foremost, on behalf of the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective, we'd like to express our deep appreciation for our co-sponsors and co-organizing entities that has made today's event possible. So our co-sponsor, the Korea Policy Institute, the indispensable Oxy Arts that has provided us with this venue, and the co-organizing entity GYOPO. And I want to mention in particular the generosity and the support from Ellie Lee, Eugene Kim, Kathy Che, and the wonderful GYOPO volunteers who make events like this possible. Thank you so much. So the title of today's talk is Reimagining the Saigu Archive, LA 1992 and the Politics of Invisible War. Before we get into the talk, like I said, we'd first like to give you an overview of the EKW Teaching Initiative. I also want to point out that there are QR codes on the back of the seats and also way at the back in the wall behind you. And basically, if you scan it with your camera, it will hyperlink you to a page that allows you to join our listserv for those of you who are interested in learning more and in participating in more. Joining our email listserv, if you're an educator, teacher, instructor, university professor who are willing to pledge to teach the Korean War in order to end it, we'll elaborate a little bit more about what that entails in our presentation today. There will be a pledge, optional pledge, to put your name down. And the second page, it's going to hyperlink you to our teaching module link, where you'll be able to see the different modules that we have on the Ending the Korean War teaching syllabus. As well as finally a donation page that directly contributes to our teaching collective initiative. So the initial idea of developing a public-facing syllabus on the Korean War was conceived in 2018 by a group of scholars and activists in our Ending the Korean War collective. Since then, we have sought to address how it is insufficient to merely teach on the Korean War within the academy, and focusing on the need for public teaching of the Korean War as a political education toolkit and to build solidarities based on nurturing an anti-imperialist mindset. So this is a collective project that will unfortunately continue indefinitely into the future until we end the Korean War. And with an aim to teach the Korean War, to end it however long it takes. And this is the kind of commitment that we're looking for. So you might ask, well, what does it mean and what does it take to teach the Korean War to end it? Now, I want you to keep this in mind because this isn't a kind of us as a collective simply unilaterally telling you or sharing knowledge, but we really think this is an organic part where we have to think about various reverberations of the Korean War that's still with us, right? So if we sort of decenter, so some things to think about. If we decenter the statist point of view that some legislature, foreign policy at the level of politics above is going to solve the Korean politics if we kind of decenter ourselves from that. Right? If deimperialization involves decolonizing our minds, breaking down the militarisms we've inherited since the Korean War to the topic of today, 1992 LA, for instance, right? Then simply teaching on the war itself as though it was confined within the Korean Peninsula is insufficient. In fact, if you kind of consider even the scholarships, as a Korean historian, the so-called left-leaning critiques of Cold War structures that nevertheless thrive on the capitalist imperialist hierarchy of academic production, knowledge production. This is a serious problem we have to reckon with. Right? We cannot simply teach and reproduce these knowledges when we want to end the Korean War. So I think one method and one heuristic is to use our online syllabi, which is always in revision. We are always open to adding new things, to revising new things onto the syllabus. So it's a very organic syllabus. So think about the online syllabus. We will show you part of it later on in the presentation as a platform to spark a set of conversation within and beyond academic spaces that critiques the profound violence and the harms of an ongoing Korean War. So a little history of how we have come to create this public syllabus and how the collective has worked over the years. Our launch of the syllabus is on the heels of a prior 3-year teaching initiative by the Alliance of Scholars Concerned About Korea, which was an activist scholar organization that culminated in eliciting 80 scholars and activists to commit to teach on the Korean War. This initial initiative, if I can give you a little bit of background, was formed on the backdrop in the context of George W. Bush's nominating North Korea as an axis of evil, right? And that too conveniently placed North Korea and Korea in the context of nuclear US war machine. And we might reflect here on how this legitimized the maintenance, this context legitimized the maintenance of US military's ability to wage a war on 2 fronts simultaneously. Right? So in addition to the Middle East, it was quote unquote committed to Korean Peninsula, something that hasn't been dismantled since the Korean War, right? How the US sort of sells itself as being committed. As a historian, I must point out that this year marks the 70th anniversary of an armistice, a pause on the Korean War, signed on July 27, 1953. But the war itself, as well as how the US continues to condone violence and warfare in its securitized state and military capacities, is far from being over. We're on the heels of this enormous momentum of 80 scholars and activists, but we also have to think about limitations of past initiative to think about how we might improve our initiative, right? And so I'd like to raise some limitations with this past initiative and how we've developed our agenda over the years. How can we be done with teaching about an unresolved Korean War just within a 3-year time span? What are the problems of framing the Korean War within the confines of critical Asian studies? Madeline, Youngo, and Christine from our collective are going to pick up on this conversation, but I want to add for a food for thought. If we kind of think about how the study of Asian and Asian diasporic community emerged as a facet of an imperial US knowledge production, but at a more simple level, does it not assign, when we call something Asian studies, does it not, when we call Korean studies within the confines of Asian studies, right, does it not confine Korean War to a problem over there, right? Precluding, for instance, how differently 1992 LA looks when construed as a reverberating effect of the Korean War and subsequent technologies of Cold War, such as putting down insurrections, riots, Cold War civil defense, to name a few, that are products of Cold War technologies waged by the US. Right? And so over the subsequent years, our teaching collective has really drawn from this important Asian American studies intervention on the Korean War that doesn't merely limit its manifestation to the Korean Peninsula. And so throughout the rest of our presentation and through today's talk, I'd ask you to keep in mind, how might we sustain this momentum about thinking about the war that is not resolved and the mode of warring that is instilled and internalized in communities on both sides of the Pacific? And what kind of critical rethinkings, actions, and teachings do we need in order to dismantle those movements? Okay, over to you, Mallory.
So as Sungmin has already pointed out so eloquently, the war is often narrated as a bounded temporal and geographical event that begins in 1950, right, and ends with the armistice in 1953. Yet us in this room and members of the Korean diaspora and other militarized diasporas know that the war is not only legally ongoing, but its effects reverberate in the Korean landscape, right, in our lives, and throughout the diaspora. So while there's plenty of work being done that's legislative to end the Korean War, our belief in teaching the war critically is part of our reckoning with the fact that the struggle for de-imperialization cannot purely be on legal grounds. So in other words, right, if de-imperialization is not just a policy solution, what is the role of education, right? Both within and in spaces outside of the university. So this is a question for all of us to kind of reflect on, and hopefully that we can also do so through the syllabus. So our syllabus also aims to bring together the work that has been done not only recently, but over decades since the Korean War by Korean scholars and activists throughout the diaspora. And our syllabus also proceeds as a springboard for continued conversation and, more importantly, continued action toward decolonizing the peninsula, as well as contesting, right, militarism, capitalism, and settler colonial violence throughout Asia, the Pacific, and the globe. So in other words, we study the Korean War not just to reframe it critically, but toward the goal of ending it. Oh. Yeah. So we're teaching it, right, to end it. Thank you for the sound check. So we envision the syllabus as a collective public resource for political education needed to end this over 70-year-long war. Whether in the classroom or for independent study groups or self-study, we hope that the syllabus can sustain the work that folks have been doing, again, for decades and for generations. And the syllabus is also committed to contesting the participation of the American university and education at large, and perpetuating the logics and the conditions of war. So contrary to the teaching of war, as Sungmin mentioned, as a foreign policy puzzle or a security concern, we want to synthesize and focus the work of ethnic studies scholars and critics and activists who are contesting US imperialism to emphasize the war as a racialized and gendered project that shapes everyday life. Finally, we also envision the syllabus as just one cornerstone, right? Or the syllabus is not the end goal, but again, a springboard of a multi-year teaching initiative on the Korean War that we are asking folks to teach out in their classrooms, in their study groups, with their friends, with their students, for as long as the war is ongoing, in order, again, to end it. And could you give me the next slide, Helen? Finally, the syllabus sort of lays out how the ongoing Korean War, again, does not solely affect the Korean Peninsula or Asia, and nor is the movement to end the Korean War located solely in Korea. We really wanted to emphasize in the kind of reverberations that we came up with for the syllabus, which you'll see later on in this presentation, that solidarity with other struggles against US empire across the globe has been a crucial part of the on-the-ground movement to end the war. And our own collective has been inspired by countless other anti-imperialist and social justice syllabi projects that are also available as public resources for folks. And those are some of those examples that have really been models for our work are listed on this slide. And we encourage you to go check them out. But in addition to kind of forging solidarity with these different kind of syllabi projects, there are also just the material and historical realities of the Korean War as a conflict that goes hand in hand with other kinds of anti-imperialist struggles that are happening right in the US and in Asia. So for example, how might we think about like Cold War civil defense and riot control as going hand in hand, right, with US military imperial intervention overseas? How might we think about the military toxification of land and water in Korea as connected, right, to military pollution in places like the Pacific or parts of North America? And how might we even think across different imperial wars? So what do we make of the Korean participation, right, in the Vietnam War, as well as in the US forever wars that continue to this very day? So these are the kinds of questions that we're hoping we can spend a little bit more time with all together today as we continue to talk about this work. I'll pass it over to Youngo. I should also mention that my name is Madeline. I am a core member of the collective as well, and I'm a PhD student at Yale in American Studies. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here.
Hi everyone, my name is Youngo Jung. I'm a graduate student at UC San Diego, and I'm working on the history of the Korean American diaspora and also a core member of the End the Korean War Teaching Collective. So what you see here are the framing questions of our larger syllabus project. And these are some of the questions that we have been guided by and posing to ourselves that we present to everyone engaging the syllabus. So we really invite everyone here to think this through together with us and build a conversation also with us, because this whole project is not solely an academic project, but also of our communities and the larger conception of belonging that within and beyond the Korean Peninsula, such as where we are right now in the diaspora and the larger definitions of it. So I'll just read over the questions, important questions. So question 1 is, what must decolonizing and de-imperializing end to the Korean War look like? The second question is, how do we challenge the assumption that the Korean War was merely a 3-year event? And right here, I'm gonna just take a couple minutes with the third question. We're actually gonna pass the mic around. So I want to pause here for like a couple minutes and throw the third question out to you guys, the audience. And so the third question is, what are the impacts of the Korean War beyond the Korean Peninsula? So if the audience has any thoughts, we'll pass around the mic. Any thoughts will be helpful.
I consider myself a product of war. I am adopted from Korea along with 200,000 other Korean babies that were exported and had our histories fictionalized or erased. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's happening in Korea right now will hopefully uncover more of the corruption in the system. So,
thank you so much. Anybody else? And so thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, just the notion of diaspora itself, how some of the Koreans who weren't South Korean or North Korean before they left the Korean Peninsula, you know, even those kind of notions of the diaspora. Or, so I'm rocking the shirt right now, which is by 전쟁 없는 세상, or World Without War, which is an anti-war pacifist organization based out of South Korea. And some of the work that they've been doing is halting the exportation of tear gas and water cannons to the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And this whole military-industrial complex in South Korea, really supported by the American Empire's military-industrial complex. So there is this larger project of that, of militarism going on constantly. So that's another example. So the fourth question is also, how do we build solidarity with other struggles against US empire and violence across the globe? And this question, I feel like this one really brings us together in conversation about the limitations and possibilities of solidarities. So I'm a historian, so I look at old newspapers and moldy documents all day, and I see these breadcrumbs and small glimpses of solidarity and forms of resistance, which is great, but they're not considered factual, right? Because it's just little hints. But as important as archives and sources are, the work of building solidarities from the ground up, having taken place in our communities through transnational grassroots activism in and beyond the Korean Peninsula. And sometimes I wonder if official archives, where official histories come from, is even the right place to search for solidarities. There is so much knowledge to be shared that a lot of us who are academics can learn from when we start to seriously consider community activism as archives and repository of memories. Next slide, please. And for the syllabus project, we have also developed various modules as part of the Ending the Korean War Collective, with topics revolving around the expensive nature of the Korean War, topics such as race, anti-communism, religion, militarism, culture, and solidarities. And Christine is going to talk about the manifestations of this.
Hi everyone, my name is Christine Hong. I'm also part of the collective, and I'm with the Korea Policy Institute. And you can see what we're talking about is actually just the very first module of the syllabus. And the central question throughout the Cold War and in Korean studies was, who started it? But given that all these US forever wars began with a pretext, the question of who started it is kind of a ruse. It distracts us from the fact that the war is not over. And so what we really wanted to do as a collective was to begin with the unendingness of the Korean War. And so we have a module, and it is you can see here, if you go to this is the Korea Policy website, you go to projects, you click on Ending the Korean War Teaching Initiative, and it takes you to this page. And if you scroll down, you'll see there's the reverberations module. This is our first module, reverberations of the unending war. You click on this, you go down, you see that there is an introduction, there are some key words, and then there are these tiles. And these tiles are each clickable, and they represent one of the manifestations of unending war. And today we're going to be focusing on the LA uprising Saigu. We will go into discussion about that today. And this is one thing that I will say. With regard to the Korean War, few people understand the broad structural implications of the Korean War. And the Korean War is far from an issue that impacts people who are ethnically Korean only. It has far-reaching structural impacts. And so what I would just say is that this also has implications for how we think of solidarity. The Korean War came on the heels of World War II. It came on the heels of World War II when the entirety of the United States had been transformed into what military strategists called the zone of the interior. And so this was what Franklin Delano Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. And when people think about figures like Rosie the Riveter, they think that she's a feminist icon. They don't think of Rosie the Riveter as a total war icon. And basically what happened during World War II was that industry that had previously been geared toward creating farming implements or what have you, all of a sudden was geared toward producing the machinery of war. You used to make tractors, now you're making tanks. And what happened was the entirety of the US economy was a total warfare economy. And what does a total warfare economy need? It needs permanent war. And you know, strategists were very open about this. They said things like, war strategists said things like, and politicians, like we needed a Korea someplace in the world. They also said Korea came along and saved us. They said things like this because it rehabilitated a US economy that was geared toward war. And so what did the Korean War do structurally? It authorized the consolidation of the national security state. It also authorized the expansion of the US military bases around the world. At a moment when McCarthyism was petering out, it reignited McCarthyism. And it set this country on permanent war footing. And so there's many ways in which the Korean War structurally exceeds Korea and Koreans and has vast implications for the United States as a military imperial power. And so here we wanted to focus on Los Angeles 1992 to think about the ways in which not just peoples and diasporas that are all located in the United States are forged through war. There are many different populations that are whose displacement is an effect of US imperial trade policy, warfare, etc. But also to think about what some of the other speakers were stating, how Los Angeles itself was zoned for war. And so how do we think about that? How do we think about the Cold War doctrine of civil defense, which was domestic warfare by another name? And so with that, I think, is there another slide or is that? I think that this, yes. Oh, actually, Janetta, would you mind?
Thank you, Christine. And so before we move on to Christine and Yusef, who's going to engage in conversation about Los Angeles, we wanted to invite you all to become members of Ending the Korean War Collective, to go to our koreapolicy.org website and to learn more about our initiative and the syllabus, and in particular, please to donate in support of the syllabus rollout. All of this work happens through volunteer work. We all have other jobs and other obligations, but we do this because we feel so passionately about this work that we do, and we learn so much by being in community with all of you. I know that we're going to all learn so much in our engagement with you, and so the QR code is here, and it's also in the back behind the chairs. If you have the means or have the opportunity, we really appreciate your support so that we can continue to do this work. Please, as Sangin had pointed out earlier, please join us so that you can be on our listserv and learn about our syllabus as it develops and events as they unfold throughout Los Angeles and other places. Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce Yusef Omowale, and we will be engaging in conversation around different images and documents from, the sort of the archives. And Yusef Omowale is a staff member at the Southern California Library. This is an amazing, amazing repository. It's a library and archive that's located in South LA, and it documents and makes accessible histories of struggles that challenge racism and other systems of oppression. This was founded 60 years ago, and it holds extensive collections of histories of community resistance in LA and beyond. And as I mentioned, I'm from the Korea Policy Institute, and this is actually an educational organization. It's anti-imperialist and grassroots, and it's dedicated to the self-determination of Korean people and also to solidarity with other peoples in their liberation struggles. And I just wanted to say that I had the pleasure of meeting Yusef when I was doing research at the Southern California Library, and it was so interesting to see. I was looking especially at different Cold War materials. It was so interesting to see how, by looking through those archives, I could see how during the Cold War, at the height of McCarthyism, Cold War radicals, Black and Korean communists and leftists were moving in a shared milieu. And this actually gave me insight into how it was that an organization like the Civil Rights Congress, which was an organization that had a heavy constitution of Black radicals, had such a searing and apt critique of the Korean War. And the fact that there was this kind of shared space and conversations and organizing went far to explaining the kind of solidarity that was emerging at a time when people were, for the most part, not taking to the streets protesting the violence of the Korean War. But Yusef, would you like to start us off?
So today we're going to talk about LA uprisings, and I heard like Yale in the house. What other universities we got? Irvine, UCLA, all the big names, right? So y'all know already kind of about this history and how we tell it as a story. So the first question to you all is, where do we begin to tell the story of 92? Where does the story start, as you know it or have heard it? Trial? And for killing Latasha Harlins?
Yes. For that was
So beating Rodney King, Latasha Harlins, that's one place the story might start, definitely. Where else have you heard or think that the story of 92 starts?
the 84 Olympics, the militarization of the city.
84 Olympics, what happened, what was the militarization that happened there?
As I understand it, LAPD is hiring and boosting, like hiring more cops, super militarized the city beyond what it happened before.
So it's militarization being a part of 92 that began, and some of that in 84.
Operation Hammer right after that.
What was Operation Hammer?
Just LAPD inundating black and brown communities, harassments, arrests.
So LAPD further increasing militarization. What else? Why are we so quiet? Because that tends to be a part of history as well, right? A lot of times there's reasons why we don't talk, we don't want to say things. There's stories that we don't want to tell.
LA city planning,
City planning. Why city planning?
like putting all the minorities in like a similar area, like, you know, a shitty environment doesn't necessarily create a best environment.
Spatial segregation, injustice, all that. Anything else?
Also, Korean merchants stepping in the place of formerly Jewish merchants in Black communities to provide, self-made senseless services where white businesses weren't willing.
And why would you associate that with the 92 uprisings?
Because there always is this narrative of Korean Black connections, and I think that the immediate one that I was going to do is the
racialized conflict is definitely a huge part of it and located with merchants. Does it matter where we begin to tell this story? If you walk in, you go to see like a mystery movie, action thriller, I don't know, whatever y'all like, and you come into the movie halfway through, what happens? Do you know what's going on? Maybe it's a lot of artists, right? With avant-garde film, and you meant to be confused. But that's an important part of the question that we were talking about, of like, you know, how do we tell these stories and where does it start and what are the consequences of where we start the story? And what you all have shared, I think, is very helpful, because that's how the story really typically is told and where it starts. There's a lot of LAPD, Black Korean conflict, merchants, militarization of police, a lot of focus on the police, some on Rodney King. Whose perspective is generally told? Like who is the protagonist of this story in the way that you typically hear it? Are Koreans usually the protagonist of the story?
I feel like Korean news media have portrayed us like Black people have done this to us kind of way. That's the narrative that I read in Korean newspaper, but when I read other sources, that doesn't have that kind of context.
So that's important too, right? Like who's telling the story? In the Korean news, you're saying Koreans are the protagonists. Who else tends to be the main characters of the story in the way that it's told?
Like public media.
What's that?
Like public media.
Public media?
White.
White, yes. And if it's white public, like white in the public media, like what are the concerns of the story?
Damage of property.
Right? Damage of property, people wilding, gotta go out and buy guns, right? After 92, a lot of people went and bought guns. They need to clean up the city. Anybody else? Who are the villains of the story?
Black people.
Black people? Y'all think black people are often the villains of the story, the way that it's told? Who are the heroes?
The police.
The police? Sometimes the police, usually they kind of the villain, but kind of the hero. A lot of times you see the heroes are like Edward Olmos and people out with brooms cleaning up afterwards, right? I think there's a famous picture, like a multicultural, like Korean, Latinx, black, white, with a fire hose putting out a fire on the rooftop, right? Those, the kind of multicultural solidarity of cleaning up and getting along tend to be the heroes, right? I think we already kind of talked about some of the main plot points of the story. Where does the story end? So we start maybe 84, maybe Latasha Harlan's. Where does it end?
It hasn't ended.
It hasn't ended. That's something to think about. In the telling of it, what's the last like chapter of the story as you've seen it? Are y'all familiar with the story? We can go over it, but I think, and we're gonna go over it today. But where does it usually end? And even like a couple years ago, right? Was it last year? Yeah, last year, the 30th anniversary. So there was a lot of retellings. What's the epilogue usually?
I think this is my recollection. It's like the National Guard came in, and that's kind of when all of it. That's kind of when it did. Yeah.
National Guard ended it. Yeah, the event. So oftentimes, and we'll look at this, the stories either like, were there convictions, what were the convictions, or where are people now, or what solutions have we tried or haven't tried, what's working, where is LA now, right? And I think what we're going to explore today is exactly that maybe it hasn't ended in the same way that we might understand, we're taught to believe that the Korean War was 3 years and it's ended. We're often there's usually a bullet point ending that has different chapters of the way that it's told to this story. So I think right now we'll look at the KPCC timeline. So KPCC, right, local news, this is their timeline. They started with the beating of Rodney King, charging the officers, trial moves, the officers acquitted, and then Bedlam, the riot breaks out. You see, those are some of the actors of the burning. Can we all get along? Curfew, Bradley and Gates. And then here, the officers are indicted on federal charges, which we'll definitely come back to because a lot of our movements, when we haven't gotten justice locally, try to seek justice federally, as we understand it. Who's this? Does anybody know Damian Williams? Anybody heard of Damian Williams before? Who's that? What's this about? Right? And so they had it on film. And I think on the film they saw like he had a Crip tattoo or something, so a gang member. And so they had 4 people that were put on trial for the beating of Reginald Denny, the white truck driver that got pulled from the car. Go ahead. So 2 officers convicted and 2 acquitted on federal charges. A settlement with King. Chief Gates, so where are they now? He died. And King died at 47. So that's kind of where they ended that story, right? So if you go to the LA Times, and please jump in at any point if you want to. So this is another one, the LA Times, you can scroll. So they start again with the beating of Rodney King. The verdict. Florence and Normandy, that's kind of like, that's the flashpoint. That's where it all went down. Parker Center, that's the police center. People went down there and messed it up. Oh yeah, flashpoint. Reginald Denny getting beat. So y'all see that when we enter the story, it's jumping on cars and burning stuff. That's when we enter. State of emergency, freeways. Curfew zone. And you can stop right here. So we're going to talk about this, right? So you can see, scroll down up a little bit, please, there. So you see the picture says, everyday life shattered. So part of what they're saying is, like, before all this happened, everyday life was put together. We was good, right? Before the inciting incident of us acting out, we were living all right, but now our everyday life is shattered. When I think probably a lot of us would argue that our everyday life was already shattered way before even 84, right? Go ahead. There's the National Guard. Oh, there y'all are, on the roof. And see, sorry, go ahead, real quick. And then that's, so where the black people's at is like messing stuff up. Y'all come in, when you don't have the guns, it's about peace, right? So through Koreans, that's how we're gonna get to peace. Go ahead. Peace. And so we're going to come back to this. Reverend Jesse Jackson is meeting with leaders in Koreatown to squash the animosities between blacks and Koreans. And then they're going to have a service at 43rd and Central They're going to be praying. And we'll come back to 43rd and Central. In USC Digital Library, I'm pretty sure they have this archive of the commission and their findings online. So again, kind of end with where are the main players, Gates and King, usually are the ones that who died during it, but both stories kind of end with the deaths of Gates and King as some of the main protagonists of this story. Does it matter that the story is told like that? What might be some of the consequences of how we are understanding what happened in our lives now based on this narrative?
One thing I noticed about both the LA Times and KPCC is that they use riots, and people have, informed and educated me that that's really, it should be, like, we're saying uprising or rebellion. So I'm wondering, as part of this teaching initiative, if there can be a discourse with the media to update their telling. Like, because I think it paints a different context. So I think language is very important. But that kind of jumped out at me, because now when I hear riots instead of rebellion or uprising, I sort of cringe because of how I've been challenged on that.
Language definitely matters.
Also, something that both sources, from what we saw just now, failed to mention at all was the media's own role in continuously ginning up tensions between communities and not acknowledging their own role and get absorbed and continue to stay.
Ishmael Reed, the writer, called that divide and conquer TV.
Also, sorry, maybe I missed it, but I didn't see anything on the timelines about some different
They both started with Rodney King.
I was just going to mention that a year prior to the uprising, the LA Times already kind of put out this, Korean Black Tension Day that mentioned that for a certain amount of times, they up to 100 amount of times before it even happened. So I always feel like the media obviously played out so much of this narrative and how, of course, this is excuse me, because obviously the focus is police brutality, but then I think in the media's perspective, why not just focus on something else so people aren't thinking about that? So why it's such a convenient narrative for Korean Black tension.
Anything else? So what we wanted to do today as a part of this syllabus and conversation is disrupt this story and kind of bring in elements from the archive, essentially our own memories and lived experiences and things that we encounter in our collective histories to bring up different questions, pose different temporality to when did this story start, when did it end, who were the players, what are the consequences, and really, hopefully, it will be clear that the conversation is about all of us today. That this isn't a repository conversation. This isn't about the past. This is talking about these histories so that we can figure out how to live our presence and create our future. So that's what we're going to do now.
Yeah. So when Yusef and I were speaking about what we might do today, we thought that we would just pause at different iconic images or documents that are from the archives and just have a conversation. And in this way also sort of trouble conventional chronological ways of thinking about LA 1992, and then also to sort of disrupt both a sense of time and place. And you know, this kind of image of what is often referred to as a roof Korean or rooftop Korean, an armed Korean merchant, has become such a singular, iconic image from this time. And as a spectacle, it's stripped of any kind of explanatory context that enables us to grasp the sense of it. And you probably might know that there is an entire sort of subculture around rooftop Koreans. The rooftop Korean is a sort of Second Amendment white nationalist meme. There are former, veterans or former members of the military that will look at news footage from this time and, you know, sort of narrate what's happening with the rooftop Korean in sort of glowing ways without understanding that there's a history here. And, you know, a lot of Korean American academics also sort of disavowed this figure. Like, this is not representative of the, you know, of the way the Korean immigrants are, you know, instead of owning this image in a way. And I think that it's really interesting to know that, and this is something, you know, a lot on Radio Korea, people were saying, this is a war. This is a war. They kept using that, and it wasn't a metaphor. And I even think that that call for peace, was that just simply an anodyne call for peace, or does that mean something from a people whose condition of displacement was an interventionist war in which an estimated 4 million Koreans were killed, the vast majority of whom were civilians. 1 in 3 families were separated. There was a radical creation of conditions of extreme insecurity. And so I think that it's interesting to know that I read this in John Lee and Nancy Abelman's book, Blue Dreams. They speak about armed Korean merchants, and they state something that I think is so interesting. A significant number of South Koreans who served in Vietnam alongside US soldiers, and we're talking 300,000 South Korean soldiers who were basically hired mercenaries, right? And they actually, a significant number of them don't even go back to South Korea from Vietnam. Vietnam becomes the way station to the United States in terms of immigration. And so these armed Korean merchants who are packing serious heat and know how to use it for a reason. They were part of a program that was referred to as More Flags. And it was superficially multinational, but what it represented was the United States in its imperial interventions, using as sub-imperial forces South Koreans, for example, using sites like Okinawa as a launching pad for aggression in Vietnam. And that history of militarization is not apparent when you take the spectacle as an isolate. The isolate strips it of a past. It strips it of any sense of cause and effect. And so we wanted to begin with this, and I wondered if you have anything you want to add.
Well, I think the other thing we're talking about endless war and the actors in this story that has been called oftentimes like the largest multicultural riot because of who got arrested and who was participating. And so if you're talking about who was in the hood at that time, like a lot of people from El Salvador were in South Central and other parts of Los Angeles getting arrested and participating. Why were they here? What happened that caused a lot of people from El Salvador, Guatemala, other places to be in those neighborhoods?
Civil war.
Where?
In those countries.
In those countries, why was there war? Or like who? So
there's a lot of U.S.-backed dictators.
Right. So that as we look at all these different participants, these colored people that's put up as the troublemakers in a variety of different ways, all have been heavily impacted by endless U.S. military aggression, right? This starts way before any of these timelines these timelines are not putting the School of Americas in the part of the story, right? And if we're talking about uprising versus riots, and that can be a long conversation, but part of what we're trying to speak to is the intentionality of the actions of people that were disrupting. And a lot of those people, the reason they were able to act intentionally in an organized fashion is because they were part of so-called gangs. And those are people that have been experiencing high intensity, low intensity warfare. So black people definitely was experiencing endless war, right? People that started MS-13, where did they come from, right? Why did they even start that? Why did the black people start gangs in LA, right? So like all it is, but also led to the various things that happened that are generally not a part of these timelines or the kind of bullet point things that we mention when we talk about the importance of this story. And I'm just getting upset, so we'll come back to it, but everybody hating on the gangs and everyone, oh, we gotta get people out of gangs and do this, and I'm not romanticizing, glorifying, but if we wanna talk about uprisings, and we talk about the revolutionary, much less transformative potential of organized entities in our communities, then we have to be in solidarity with gangs, and we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But,
And I think that it's, people also don't think about the fact that with Korea and then U.S. interventions in Central America, this doesn't go by the Cold War name of containment, right? There's nothing sort of, it's not just political repression through, it's not political repression through principally nonviolent means. It's actually, and that doesn't even hold true domestically, it's rollback is the rollback of communism by any means necessary. And with rollback, you are willing to, you go in there, and I think that it's interesting to think about this. When the United States military enters or invades a site, and it does so, and historically, like with Korea, it was with counterintelligence forces at the very forefront of the war machine. Counterintelligence. And it operates in a certain way. You decapitate the leadership. This may sound familiar for those of you who study COINTELPRO, and there's a reason for it. So you decapitate the leadership. You have drawn up your blacklists. Those people are dead. You have your gray lists, wavering, not sure of their affinity. And then you have the white list, those that you know will collaborate with you. And, this is, so with regard to Korea and Central America, I'll say that these were both campaigns of sustained rollback. And so it's interesting to think about Los Angeles. Some people have spoken about how it's a carceral geography. Rarely do we think about LA as a war geography, an imperial geography. And I think that here we have an opportunity to do so. Yeah, and so I wanted to show this. This is from a film that you might have seen falling down, and it's Joel Schumacher's film. It comes out in 1993, and if you're talking about who's the protagonist, okay, the protagonist is this figure, Defense. Okay, and the reason he's called Defense is he works in the military-industrial complex. This is a kind of story about like the end of the Cold War, the fact that you know, these kinds of defense industries, which actually structure the landscape of California, and particularly Southern California, that all of a sudden he's out of work. Okay, supposedly this is like the time of this peace dividend, what have you, so he's out of work. He's got his sort of weird 1950s attire for the early 1990s, his horn-rimmed glasses, his sort of crew cut, and his, you know, his outfit. And he enters into the kind of primal scene. So a lot of films, rap, you know, poetry, around a lot of cultural works. The primal scene is the Korean immigrant-owned convenience store, right? And so he enters into here, and I think that this is an interesting scene, and I would like for us to just view it because of the ways that it obliquely references an unending war. The way that it references debt, the way that it mentions 429, and the fact that Saigu is one way that Koreans mark events, uprisings, tragedies with the date, right, the numbers. But in many cases, it's numbers that when something begins without a sense of its conclusion. And it's interesting to see that 429 also appears in here. But let's go ahead and watch this.
Get some change for the phone. No change. I have to buy something. What?
85 cents.
I don't understand.
85 cents. 85 cents.
85 cents? That doesn't give me enough money for the phone call. I'll give you 50 cents, you give me 50 cents change.
No way.
Yes, way.
Drink, 85 cents. You pay or go.
It's a phi. I don't understand a phi. There's a V in the word. It's five. You don't got V's in China?
Not Chinese. I'm Korean.
Whatever. You come to my country, you take my money, you don't even have the grace to learn how to speak my language. You're Korean. You have any idea how much money my country has given your country?
How much?
I don't know. It's got to be a lot. You can bet on that.
You go now. No trouble.
I stay. What do you think of that? God, where you go? Get back. What do you do? Get back those streets. Go. Go. Let go. Jesus Christ! What is this? The last stand on Fiji? What?
Take your hands away from your cameras. Stop it!
I speak slowly and distinctly.
Take the money.
You think I'm a thief? No. See, I'm not the thief. I'm not the one charging 85 cents for a stinking soda! You're the thief! Just standing up for my rights as a consumer. I'm rolling back prices to 1965. What do you think of that? Donuts. Package of 6, how much? $1.12. Oh! Too much. Aspirin. Price? $3.40. Oh, please. AA batteries, package of 4. $4.29. Nice try. Well, I think this whole shelf looks suspect. One soda, 12 ounces. 50 cents. So, it's been a pleasure frequenting your establishment.
So, I teach a class on LA 1992, and I teach this film. This figure defense is on a journey to the west side and increasingly becomes militarized along the way. But I think that it's interesting, the sort of dense references, the sort of term rollback, the prices, you know, a reference to rollback possibly in as a sort of U.S. Strategy, war strategy. And then also 1965. That's the year that there's a supposed liberalization of U.S. immigration law, and it's after that that Korean immigration, you know, spikes. And so, like, let's roll this back to a time from, you know, when before you could come in, but also this is a kind of, you know, white grievance narrative. You know, it has a certain kind of resonance right now too, and you know, I think it's also interesting to think about the fact that there's this extended discussion of debt. And this extended discussion of debt, do you know how much your country owes my country? You know, a sort of language, you know, for those of us who have read Mimi Lin, like thinking about like these discourses of debt that, that attend U.S. wars of intervention. And to be indebted is to be a figure of excess, you know, within the United States. You're in a position of having this undischargeable debt. And I think it's interesting to know that Lyndon Johnson, with regard to South Korean mercenaries who were deployed to Vietnam, described their service as a debt of honor. And so one war was tied to another war in very intimate and profound ways. Yusef, would you like to say anything about this scene?
No, play the next one now.
20 de-energizers.
20 C energizers?
D, not C, D.
C.
C, energize us.
D, motherfucker, D. Learn to speak English first, all right? D.
How many you say?
20, motherfucker, 20.
Who's honey?
What the fuck are you?
Motherfucker, you all right, man, you all right. Just give me the motherfucking batteries, all right? 20D fucking batteries. Hey, wait, what's the date on them? What's the date on them? The fucking date. What? Can you fucking speak English? The date.
The marcher.
What about March?
1991.
Oh, March. It's March, motherfucker, March. Yo, man, you sure that's 20? No, take them out, man. Count them again.
What?
Count the shits again, man.
So, that's Do the Right Thing, and that's from 1989 in New York, so before 92, not in LA. And I think to point over here, like, these kind of racialized conflict were in conversation even before 92. And we're placed together in enclosures of suffering, and the conflict that occurs between us is what then we end up spending time trying to figure out how to resolve, rather than the violences of racial capitalism, right? And so after 92, in particular, there was a lot of kind of Black Korean workshops on, like, for storekeepers to, like, how to be respectful to Black people and look them in the eye and put the money in the hand, and that these were things that would prevent future uprisings if we could teach each other these kinds of niceties and human relations solutions. And so, again, I think there's complicated conversations to have about interactions in different settings and interactions that have occurred in both more positive and negative. But really that's so much besides the point, and not a story that, to me, we're at all interested in or are going to benefit from. What do we do with Black Korean conflict? Years later it became Black-Brown conflict in the same neighborhoods. But it's always an attempt to racialize and individualize conflict and not place it in the context of endless war, of counterinsurgency and militarization. And those are the conflicts that we should be talking about more than how to put money in my hand and count out the I mean, literally it'd be like, well, this is how you count the change and do this and that, and then the Black people won't hurt you, and those are real conversations in 92.
So you just briefly saw the prior image, which was Lyndon Johnson in '65 going to South Korea and getting this pledge from the US-backed military dictator Park Chung-hee to have, this huge, it's 1/3 of a million soldiers deployed to the Vietnam theater. And I wanted to just go to the next slide and just show you that this is what Nancy Abelman John Lee stated, that this was an opportunity for South Koreans to repay, this language of debt, the United States for its contributions during the Korean War, the United States, and it's this narrative again, protected South Korea against a North Korean attack. And, schooled in the crucible of anti-communism, South Koreans knew exactly what to do, having had it done to themselves. And then here you have An Jung-hyo, a journalist and a novelist, who writes, and he's describing a novel that he has written about the Vietnam War. And he says, so these soldiers were told and believed that they were going to Vietnam to preserve the peace, right? And to keep the peace, right? And to pay back what they owed, it's this undischargeable debt. I mean, even with like George W. Bush and the coalition of the willing, it's this undischargeable debt forever, for perpetuity. And they believed that they were doing to and for Vietnam what Koreans had done in Korea. And they're dressed in American uniforms, armed with American weapons, eating American sea rations, and even paid by the government, although not at the same prices. They were cheaper guns for hire, and they were acting as Americans. And so, part of this is starting to get at, too, the United States with regard to the Korean War. Barack Obama in 2013 at the Korean War Memorial on the National Mall was saying that, you might think that we didn't win Korea, but actually Korea was a victory. This is what he said. And he said, because if African American, Native American, Asian American, white American, Mexican American soldiers could fight shoulder to shoulder over there, surely we could do the same at home. And so he frames the Korean War as almost like at the vanguard of civil rights reforms domestically, and he says for that reason it's a victory. But how do we understand the liberal value of a war in which 4 million people, the majority of whom are civilian, are killed? How do you recuperate, and he says, what's the lesson of the Korean War? Barack Obama then states, he says, the lesson of the Korean War to our enemies and our allies is that the United States will maintain the world's greatest military, bar none, always. He states this. And I think it's interesting to think about how there's this kind of backslapping sort of congratulation, self-congratulation about the fact that supposedly the Korean War, with the desegregation of the US military that happens on the battlefield, that it is some kind of, it inaugurates desegregation and the multiculturalization of the United States. But it's actually the case, too, that you could see that what emerges, and these things are not considered in tandem, these guns for hire, South Korean men who are deployed to Vietnam, they're not usually incorporated into a civil rights narrative of something sort of, they're viewed as sub-imperial forces. This is, it's part of Nixon's Vietnamization. Don't have like the Americans do it, get Asian boys to do it. Okay, just get the Asian boys to do it. And so that's not usually part of a kind of progressive or liberal narrative. But I think that it's really important to understand that that too is part of the multiculturalization of the US military. And it's deployed in imperial and fascistic ways against peoples in Asia and elsewhere around the globe. Continuing up until Central America. Indigenous soldiers are trained in the School of the Americas. So I thought that it was interesting to just go back to this article. And this is a sort of interim piece, but it indicates something that I think is really interesting. That what happens is that, and even if we think about a term like the Department of Defense, does anyone know what it was formerly called before it was the Department of Defense? It was the Department of War. Far more honest answer, right? So like we have the Department of Defense, and we have this notion of US, even civil defense, which I was saying before is domestic war, goes under the rubric of defense, right? And it goes back to what Yusef was saying, whose perspective is that? What position does that sort of, enshrine? But you can see here, this is from 1986, and it's a discussion of FEMA and the role that FEMA is playing. And you can see here that Reagan signs a National Security Decision Directive. The president unilaterally declared a state of domestic national security in the event of direct US military intervention in Central America. And so under the directive's provisions, FEMA was going to play a war role. It is not true that it's only with Homeland Security that the United States starts waging multi-directional warfare, including domestically. You can see that it's happening well before that, and this is not even the starting point. And so FEMA would then be called upon to enforce the domestic side of the administration's Central American War Plan. Okay, so then you could see on the bottom here, this plan was similar to Garden Plot. This was Nixon's, so it was a contingency plan that was designed to round up and detain thousands of US citizens opposed to the Vietnam War. And so you could see again in this next column that the state of emergency, in this state of emergency, FEMA's role would be to silence dissent, and it would use National Guard units to arrest, detain, and imprison undocumented Central American migrants. And if, for those of you who studied COINTELPRO, look at the next paragraph. This kind of broad authority to arrest, the sort of police state, would be, there would be whitelists and blacklists, and the blacklist is the administrative index. Those whose names were on there would be arrested and detained at these different detention centers. So I just wanted us to look at this, and can we go to the next slide? Or do you want to say anything? You can see these here, but you can go to the next slide. It's fine. Good. Yusef, do you want to? Okay. We can go to the next one. And so here you can see garden plot. It's 1968. And you can see that there are, garden plot was so extraordinary. So under this Cold War rubric of civil defense, and you know, I don't know if you recall in Ruth Wilson Gilmore's essay on, let me see if I can find this. She states this thing about, let me see if I can find it. She says that the United States can claim permanent ideological surplus in the realm of defense. Indeed, and she puts out quotation marks, indeed, from the genocidal wars against Native Americans to the totalitarian chattel slavery perpetrated on Africans to colonial expansion to the obliteration of radical racist and anti-capitalist movements, the annals of U.S. history document a normatively aggressive, crisis-driven state. Its MO for solving crises has been the relentless identification, coercive control, and violent elimination, not just of foreign enemies over there, but domestic enemies here. And you can see that these operational war plans are for warfare there and here, hand in glove, right, together. And so with Operation Garden Plot, you know, urban areas, you know, in the wake of one race riot after another, you know, that happens in the 1960s, you can see that the United States militarily develops a war plan for the domestic arena. And indeed, in the Pentagon, there's a room that's called the domestic war room. And this is the way that sites are identified as sites of potential insurgency. So this is counterinsurgent policy. High unemployment rate among minority groups, increased crime rates among minorities, protests arising from income disparities between minority and majority groups, declining rapport between local officials and minority groups, migrations of large numbers in minority groups, protests by minority groups to such conditions as slum conditions, segregation, lack of jobs, lack of rec facilities, police brutality, overpricing practices locally. So this is how a site is determined to be a site of possible insurgency. Would you like to say?
You can stay right here. So, has anybody heard of weed and seed? If you haven't, what would you guess that a government project to solve some of the problems of 1992 uprisings called Weed and Seed, what do you think would be involved? If you haven't heard of it, what would you guess that that project is?
That'd be like infiltration.
Infiltration? The government infiltrating? Possibly. Infiltration, one way or another, I think so. Anybody else have any guesses about, we got a lot of garden stuff going on today. But weed and seed, what do you think weed and seed is? They come into the hood with weed and seed. All right, you can go to the next slide. So Operation Weed and Seed, President George Bush, 92, said, it works this way. First, we join federal, state, and local forces to, quote, weed out the gang leaders the violent criminals and the drug dealers who plague our neighborhoods. When we break their deadly grip, we follow up with part 2. We, quote, seed those neighborhoods with expanded education opportunities and social services. The key to the seed concept will be jobs-generating initiatives such as enterprise zones to give people who call these neighborhoods home something to hope for. So you can go to the next one. So right, weed and seed is just like it sounds like. We're going to take out all the weeds in the neighborhood that are causing all the problems. And the problem, again, is us. It's not counterinsurgency and war and government and all this garden plot stuff. And then we're going to seed it with all the nice government nonprofit solutions. Probably give a grant to the Southern California Library to do literacy and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's also, you see, like the nonprofits and social services all become very much an extension of counterinsurgency in our communities. You can go to the next slide. So program possibilities, some of the things that could be part of weeding: law enforcement, Project Trigger Lock, I don't know what y'all can look at that, Achilles, street sales, task force, all these things become a part of the weeding. Judges training and victim issues, supervision, pretrial drug testing, the whole gamut. Accountability program, denial of federal benefits user accountability program. That's like they think you hustling, like your EBT type thing probably. Go ahead, next one. So, law enforcement, community oriented. Drug-free zones, adopt a school, business watch, drug-free recreational centers, volunteer programs, marches, rallies, victim services, right? These are all essentially seen as an extension of policing. So a lot of things that even nowadays our communities that we call for as an alternative to policing, community centers, volunteer, like this is essentially like our slate of demands as alternatives to policing now, which I would argue is part of the success of the state post-92. Go to that. Educational programs, McGruff, y'all know if y'all remember the drug, McGruff dog, whatever. Here's looking at you 2000, refusal skills. One things they had comedians teach young people in South Central how to tell jokes. Job Corps, like these are all the things that essentially, as you can see, Operation Clean Sweep, Chamber of Commerce, these are extensions of policing. Go ahead. And let me see, I was going to read something else real quick. How weed and seed will work. Pursuant to program guidelines promulgated by the Attorney General, local entities will submit applications to the Department of Justice that target previously designated enterprise zones with documented drug, gang, and violent crime problems, identify existing federal, state, and local resources for targeted community that will be dedicated to the weed and seed effort, identify private sector resources, so public-private partnerships, including corporate contributions, and demonstrate a balanced, comprehensive plan which addressed getting violent offenders off the streets, support drug and crime prevention, etc. Y'all know what enterprise zones were? Anybody heard of enterprise zones? I think Jack Kemp started as Republican during the Reagan administration, but essentially becomes a geographical area that you zone for deregulation, tax incentives. You're trying to get corporations to open businesses and do things to stimulate the economy in that area. So essentially, instead of giving people money in the community, you give corporations tax breaks and subsidies and all kinds of benefits. And historically, we know and it's shown does not trickle down, it does not benefit our communities. So you can go to, did you want to say something? I'll come back to that in a second. So at the time, So this is from our archives. Coalition Against Police Abuse was an organization at the time. They wrote on the cover, "Stop This Racist Plan." So at the time, community-based organizations across the spectrum politically understood this as a form of policing and essentially a racialized, racist system of intervention in our communities.
And you can see this language like reclaiming America's neighborhoods. I mean, that reclaiming too, the fact that this is an operational plan, it's an O plan, right? This operational plan, you know, if we understand this as a kind of strategy of the war machine deterritorializes, right? it determines, you know, to use like a term from World War II, mass incarceration of, you know, ethnic Japanese, you divide the population into populations that are the spoilage, you know, that probably need to be deported, that need to be, you know, thrown away. There's spoilage versus the salvage. And there's a kind of weeding and seeding of populations too, and it's an intelligence operation as well, you know? And this reclaiming isn't just like this sort of, it is a form of deterritorialization that's followed by reterritorialization, and that's a war operation.
You can go to the next slide. So this was the Labor Community Strategy Center, who's still around today, in '92. Again, kind of talking about how they understood we didn't see working against communities and what negative policing was going to happen if we didn't see comes in, right? That is a program moves towards the imposition of police state on the public life of low-income communities of color. So that's in '92. You can go to the next slide. So today, in the last few years, this is Slate Z, which is called a promise zone. So before Obama left office, he started something called promise zone, which he said he modeled after enterprise zone, which was to create incentivized geographies where businesses could get tax incentives, tax incentive deregulation, you get extra points for getting federal grants and all that. So the first promise zone in LA, I think was in MacArthur Park maybe, somewhere around here, but it wasn't in South Central. And so a bunch of groups in South Central said, wow, it's really racist that you wouldn't give us the government aid of being designated a promise zone. So at least 140 organizations, USC, UCLA, demanded that an area of South Central be designated a promise zone, which is the same thing as an enterprise zone, which we have a lot of history to show does not benefit our communities. But the social justice, nonprofit organized groups today demanded that we get a promise zone. So the South LA one is called Slate Z, right? Jobs, prepare students, enhance infrastructure, reduce violent crime through youth leadership development, gang intervention and support. These all are very, very similar to the language you saw in Weed and Seed. And if I couldn't find a slide, but if you look at, and some of them have been removed because it's a little bit older. I think Trump has called it a opportunity zone now. But the criteria to be eligible to be designated a promise zone is very similar to the items that the garden plot saw that were indicators of potential violence. So to submit your proposal, you have to show that there's a certain level of unemployment, there's a certain level of crime, all these things to be designated a promise zone, right? So historically, we understood enterprise zones and other things not only as bad for our communities, but also in a lot of ways an extension of policing. Today, the same kind of parallel groups, the contemporary groups, are advocating for them as Slate Z and opportunity zones, et cetera. You can go to the next slide. So this is about safe passage from schools. So local community nonprofits are getting like $1 million grants from the government to develop safe passage programs so that young kids in the hood can go from home to school without being bullied or messed with by other community members. And so you can see, let's see, is this the slide? Yeah, so in this overview of safe passage, in their brochure, a little bit down, you can see that funded by Department of Justice Community Weed and Seed grants. They're tying this to the early '90s Weed and Seed program. And literally, the people that do this work have been on university panels, and their position on the panel is to be the alternative to policing. And in their brochure, they historically are able to say, we come out of Weed and Seed because no one remembers what Weed and Seed was. When Weed and Seed came out, everyone's like, this is a racist policing program. Now it's being offered as literally the alternative to policing by community groups and universities. And so that they can say without any shame in their own brochure, this comes out of Weed and Seed. You can go to the next one. And it's also very gendered and all kinds of stuff. And so it's also tied, it kind of comes out of this safe routes. And you can see education, evaluation, monitoring, engineering, enforcement, encouragement. We don't even have to read what's underneath these words, like you already understand, and this is very connected to '92. Right? The story has not ended, the war has not ended, counterinsurgency is still going on. I don't even know if it's different, but now we put it on our t-shirts and being on panels touting it as a solution to policing in our communities. Go ahead. This is the other D part, so I was just going through their little pamphlet. Multiculturalism. This is a part of the benefits and how they structure their safe passage. I think there's one more after this. Oh, no, you can, oh, yeah, you can go back. I don't know if you have anything you want to say about it. No? So you can go to the next slide. So this is about the LA4. So you remember Damian Williams was on trial, right, for beating up Reginald Denny, like he was on camera and all that, gang member, etc. So part of one of the things that we want to bring up is a notion of relative innocence, right? The notion that there are bad elements in our communities that we need to weed out, and there's good ones that we need to seed and benefit, right? So there's bad Koreans with guns, and there's good Koreans who are sweeping up and fighting for peace. And we know what to do with the bad ones, and we know what to do with the good ones. And for MS-13, like Trump can go lock up MS-13, but don't come for my grandmother, right? But I'm a dreamer, and I have a claim to citizenship because I didn't choose to come here, and I'm going to Yale, and so like I deserve benefits and let me stay here. We know how that turned out. So that historically we have to be very clear of hopefully disabusing ourselves of the notion of good and bad, and we want that we need the nigger, we need, yeah, I'll say, I'm sorry, so I try not to say as much no more, but we need the nigger to define ourselves as the good citizen, right? That's the role that these actors in the hood play, and we need to stop doing that and be in solidarity with Damian Williams. So in '92, this is an archive that we got that communities, and you can see a list of organizations, etc., were fighting for the LA4. You had grandmothers and mothers that were organizing for these young men in our community who were on tape brutalizing another human being and had gang affiliations. And they said at the time that they were very clear that like, yo, this is not about these four individuals and what they did. This is about state violence and policing in our communities, and that's what we need to be focused on. And I guarantee you today, Nipsey Hussle got killed. Nipsey Hussle, right, his hood, near the library hood. And there's a lot of nonprofits, arts organizations act like they love Nipsey Hussle now. I guarantee you, I don't know, play some of his videos, they do not love Nipsey Hussle, but now that he's dead, they can claim that they do. But they need to. Because if we're not going to claim Nipsey Hussle, if we're not going to claim all of our people, we're all susceptible to counterinsurgency and violence and being separated and suffering in these ways. And in '92, communities rallied. And I guarantee you that if someone from the hood was beating up a white person on camera, that our communities would not rally in defense of them. That when the George Floyd uprisings, whatever that we're going to talk about, what did the marchers and organizers and activists say about the looters? Y'all remember in the news?
But they're not with us. They're like outside agitators.
They're like, yo, that's not even us, right? The George Floyd activists, in '92, we was down with everybody in 2000, whatever it was, George Floyd, a couple years ago, or a year, I don't even know time no more. These fools were saying they not with us. I live in Long Beach, I was watching the news when that stuff jumped off. I saw the people come down and loot the stores, and I recognized not literally the individuals, but I recognize them from the hood where I work at the library. Because the people that came to loot in Long Beach didn't live in Long Beach. But they was black people and other colored people that had a plan in the same way they go rob a house. They said like, oh, they about to have a march, we can go get something. And they went and did that because they understood that the George Floyd march, which is another conversation we'll get to, was not for their communities. And instead of saying, yo, that's part of our community too, and they might say, oh, because if the activists burn something, they say, well, why are we worried about property instead of people? But they clearly said, we not with these looters. In '92, they was like, yo, we the looters. That's how far we've come. That's what's changed. Is that, and I'm not even glorifying, romanticizing '92. They said a lot of messed up stuff too. But that's why we're talking about it. Because today we in favor of counterinsurgency. We doing the job of saying, yo, lock them up, but I'm the good activist revolutionary. I'm not here to do that. Yeah. It upsets me, so I'm sorry, but that's why. You can go to the next slide.
Yeah, so, you know, one of something that startled me, so this is a 1951 petition, We Charge Genocide. And William Patterson, who's pictured here and in the middle in the line of cut, was a key author of this petition. And it was circulated in 1951, and in fact, Paul Robeson went to the United Nations and delivered a copy to the UN. And it's in this petition that charges the United States with genocide for the crime of lynching that there is an account in there that was so striking to me also. It's 1951 of the Korean War. And I think it's the next slide, is it? Yeah, here it is. And I'm just going to read it just so that we can dwell on the language. I know you could read it, but we Negro petitioners whose communities have been laid waste, whose homes have been burned and looted, whose children have been killed, whose women have been raped, have noted with peculiar horror that the genocidal doctrines and actions of the American white supremacists have already been exported to the colored peoples of Asia. We solemnly warn that a nation which practices genocide against its own nationals may not be long deterred if it has power from genocide elsewhere. White supremacy at home makes for colored massacres abroad. Both reveal contempt for human life in colored skin. Jelly gasoline, that's napalm, and more was used in the Korean theater than in Vietnam. In Korea, it's not a competition, but people don't realize this about Korean War. Jelly gasoline in Korea and the lyncher's faggot at home are connected in more ways than that both result in death by fire. The lyncher and the atom bomber are related. The first cannot murder unpunished and unrebuked without so encouraging the latter that the peace of the world and the lives of millions are endangered. This isn't metaphysics. The tie that binds both is economic profit, political control, right? Its militarism is the use of superior force to achieve political and economic ends, right? It was not without significance that it was Truman who spoke of the possibility of using the atom bomb on colored peoples of Asia, and that it's American statesmen who pray constantly of Asiatic horror, right? And so this is referencing the fact that, the United States with MacArthur envisioned what he called a zone of cobalt between the Korean Peninsula and China, that through the deployment of atomic weapons would not allow life to live for 100 years, right, to prevent sort of Chinese coming in defense and of North Koreans. But I wanted to share this with you because this is actually, that date is wrong. It's 1951. Sorry about that. But can we go to the next slide? So this is a wartime pamphlet. The war's not over, so we'll just reserve this for like the hot fighting period. And on the Korean War battlefield, this multi-page pamphlet was part of what was leafleted and found on the ground. And it's explicitly addressed to Negro soldiers. You have an image up there of a black private from the US military who is in a POW camp and shaking hands with a volunteer from the Chinese army. And it's addressed, as you see, like it's a direct address, Negro soldiers. And I was saying to Yusef that it almost seems like this is a kind of address or conversation between Negro soldiers as cannon fodder and then North Koreans and Chinese that represent the target. So the target and cannon fodder are having a kind of conversation. And you can see this is also an interesting pamphlet because it begins, and I haven't shown this to you, but it begins with an itemized account of the lynchings that have happened stateside. Because the US military suppressed the circulation of black media on the battlefronts of Korea to prevent demoralization, right? So demoralization was seen as a hair's breadth away from sedition. And so rather than like dealing with the racism of the military, it was instead viewed as a sort of pathway to racism. People who experience racism were viewed as potential insurrectionists. But you can see here that the states, don't you see this war against the colored people of Korea as the same kind of dirty business as discrimination against you? And then it quotes directly from the Civil Rights Congress petition, which I think is so interesting. Can we go to the next page? And so I wanted to, would you like to say anything about that? Okay. Yeah. You could see that during this time there was a peace petition campaign. And this is another moment in which peace was, like defense, a kind of term that was being sort of fought over. The sort of contestation over the term was intense. And so there are these rallies for peace during this period, like, this is the early 1950s, 1950, 1951. And you can see here too that there's a kind of description about different points of analysis. And it says there's time to save our country from atomic catastrophe. There needs to be peaceful mediation in Korea. Peace has to happen, and it suggests a local, like it says, come on out for this. And I just wanted to go to the next.
And so that's because the flyer you saw was for 43rd and Central Los Angeles, and this is a photograph of 43rd and Central Los Angeles, 1965, and the Watts uprisings, right? You can go to, from UCLA, just to make sure they don't get mad. And then this picture is from 41st and Central, 1969, when there was a raid, 300 police officers were raiding the Black Panther headquarters in Los Angeles. And so part of that is just very quickly to say that, again, like the terrain itself, the geography has an extended history, that oftentimes we want to locate one kind of single event. But if we look at no, this kind of endless war, these militarization has been going on in these spaces for a long time. And just to make then all these things that we're looking at, that we can go in assuming that there's a lot of photographs, right? That can go back to 53, before that, ahead of time, but it's not just Florence and Normandy, 92.
And so just what Yusef is saying, if you were part of this peace campaign, you were placed in the crosshairs of the FBI. That became, the very fact that that location was listed on the flyer meant that there would be the surveillance of the state, for sure, right? And so you could see here from the LA Times, 1950, how do you handle those peace petitioners? And so here it's don't trust them, it's a Trojan dove, okay? Someone's talking about peace, that's a Trojan dove, don't trust it at all. What should you do? Okay, don't punch him in the nose, don't slam the door in his face. Reds are used to that, right? The thing to do is ask him for his credentials or identification. Get his name or address if you can. Take a good look at him. And then telephone the FBI. Truman has asked all loyal citizens to report subversive activities known to them, but get some facts first, and above all, don't sign that petition, right?
And to the point about the media earlier, that's LA Times saying that.
So you could see that even housewives from the valley were getting, arrested. Okay, so it's this phony peace because, and you look at this, anyone who was passing out these peace petitions, they got arrested, right? They got arrested, and then you could see that. I just want you to see this. This is a different account, and this is all from the Southern California Library. Pitt, Flores, and Bourdin were out on Central Avenue about noon, circulating those peace petitions. These are Trojan doves out there, right? They're stopped by police who said that someone read the LA Times, they did the right thing, right? They phoned in saying, these peace petitioners, they are disturbing the peace. The peace petitioners are disturbing the peace. And so I just wanted to, would you like to say anything about this? Okay, can we go to the next one? But to also understand that there's, in the Southern California Library, there are also the Korean Independent or 독립신문 is also there. And you could see this, that Lee Sung-man, who is the dictator in South Korea, which only has had its formation, it had no positive political content. Its formation was strictly anti-communist. And you could see that Lee Sung-man, the US-backed dictator who's installed there, that these leftist Koreans in LA, they're saying, wait, that ally of the United States, he's disturbing the peace. Okay, it's not that we're disturbing the peace, he's disturbing the peace. The consequence of saying things like that is that those Korean leftists were key targets of HUAC, right? So they get called up for their supposed, sort of rabble-rousing, sort of, they're sort of communist moles, etc., but they get called up before state power.
And in this, the dominant telling of 92, who is disturbing the peace? Who were the people disturbing the peace in 92, according to, like, the LA Times is going to write about it? Black people, Korean, brown people, right? So part of this is being very clear. If we're going to march for peace, we need to be clear what we mean, because normally the way they talk about it is, oh, the National Guard was coming to restore order and peace. And usually by peace, we mean order, and we mean, like, we're not going to fight each other. We don't mean an end to war. We don't mean these other kinds of things when we say we're marching for peace. And so we often fall into the same thing that they're saying about that we are the ones disturbing the peace, and we're going to be good citizens and no longer do so. And we're going to cooperate with the National Guard and whoever to restore order. And I think that was a very clear conversation in 92.
So I wanted to say too that, one of the figures that was brought up before the House Un-American, Activities, committee was David Hyun. And so David Hyun, his family has a trajectory through Hawaii, and this becomes an extremely celebrated case. And it's not without its, I think that Yusef has such an interesting analysis of this particular case, and I'll yield to you about that in just a moment. But I think that one of the interesting things legally that they were doing, because this is another thing too, it's like with LA 1992, one of the effects of the mobilization of state forces in a time of crisis was the massive deportation of undocumented migrants, massive deportation. And also during this time of, this early Cold War moment, this McCarthyist moment, you see that one of the ways that the state was responding to these agitators was even with someone like David Hyun, who's actually US born, was a deportation trial. Like, let's just deport him, and which Korea will he go to, right? He's not even born in Korea. Let's deport him to South Korea, the US ally. And then the legal team says, the respondent, i.e. Hyun, opposes such deportation on the grounds that if he's deported to South Korea, he's going to be persecuted and likely killed. I mean, what does that say about a US ally? I think that that's really interesting as a legal strategy, saying you send him back to, your ally, he's going to be killed, summarily killed. Is that the choice?
And I don't know the case that well, but I think, I don't know if it's on here, we can go forward. Do you have another one, or is this the one? Okay, we can go. That a lot of the folks that were trying to fight his defense case and not have him be deported would make claims to his proximity to kind of whiteness, to U.S. citizenship, that he had, I think, he married an American, he was in the military, is like someone, either he or his family was like a pastor, they just had all these things to try to kind of say this is an exceptional, this is a seed and not a weed. And I think that's part of the challenge for us. And so we look at that example a lot, and there's other ones in our collections where how do we make an argument that doesn't demonize the rest of our communities, right? By claims that like, hey, well, you know, like he went to Yale and volunteered with the kids every Saturday and this and that, and like don't deport him. And it's like, well, yo, I didn't go to Yale. I'm not David, I don't have like 2 kids and I served in the military, so what's gonna happen now? And I think that's a big issue that comes up a lot.
So I know we're running short on time, but maybe we'll just go through some of the other ones quickly. You could just see here that, you know, here South Korea is understood as a police state, and some, you know, leftist journalists are calling it such. And also this Korean independence is referring to Seungmin Rhee as a U.S. puppet, and that the mass execution of people is an American crime, that the use of incendiaries it's basically a bombing holocaust in Korea.
So this is more just images for that relative innocence conversation, right, dreamers? I'm not a criminal. No more innocent bloodshed. Why has it got to be innocent? I'm a scholar, not a criminal. That's from students at USC, right? So it's like, we all mean very well and we're trying to fight for our own humanity in our communities, but we're always articulating ourselves in opposition to the criminalized other that looks just like us. So similar to like you saw on those timelines where like the police officers got federal charges, and I don't know how much y'all know Vincent Chin case. I didn't learn this a couple years ago, and I was amazed at like, yo, like they didn't really ask for no justice transformation for communities as a whole. They just wanted police to get locked up and bring federal charges. And my personal feeling, which I guess is a long conversation we don't have a lot of time, is like we could have saved a lot of going through that BLM stuff of like, because today justice for our communities means locking up police officers. That doesn't seem to quite be abolition to me. Not that I'm not concerned what happens to police officers, but that's not to say justice for our communities, right? And so the Vincent Chin case is very similar in that like, oh, the people that killed Vincent Chin didn't get found guilty, so now we want to bring federal charges so that they can go to prison. And that was essentially the campaign, which again, I would argue, I don't think is that liberating. And part of what was the attempt in '92 in terms of discourses was to take things from kind of collective transformation and justice to make it about justice for Rodney King, right? Like he got a settlement from the city. And so, and now we, Asian hate, we can talk about. In the next slide, you'll see one of the things that happened. So again, here's Black Lives Matter saying like, you know, what they really matter about is what's happening to the police officers. And so in '92, I don't know, is the next one the last? So connected to that, in '92, at least my memory is that while some people called it the Rodney King riots, there was a lot of resistance to not identifying as the King riot because people were upset not just about what happened to Rodney King, and not even just the police, but they were upset and angry about the conditions that they had been suffering for a long time, for an endless amount of time. And so people didn't want to call it the Rodney King. But somehow, 30-some years later, like now we call it the George Floyd uprising, right? And part of the state's interest is to turn our demands into individual rights for a person versus collective for a community, right? And so what is justice for Breonna Taylor? That her killers, the police officers, get locked up. That's not justice for black women who are vulnerable to premature death. That's not justice for young people in our communities who don't have a quality education, is that the killers of George Floyd get locked up. So it's just interesting that 30 years ago, we were very clear that like, yo, this is not just about Rodney King. It doesn't mean we don't love that brother and are sad and upset and angry forever for what happened to him. But we are not calling this the Rodney King riot. And now, literally, I just did this morning. I don't know, none of these books, none of these authors, so nothing personal. But like, yo, we call this the George Floyd uprising. Like, counterinsurgency is very effective apparently. Because somehow now we've taken it from demands for collective transformation, justice, for the 10-point platform, the Black Panther Party, for every community has had their demands that include all of us, to getting police officers locked up when they kill us. And that benefits the state. They ain't got no problem locking up a few police officers. And so hopefully that part of, I'll turn it back, like what we're seeing today is that the flashpoint is not Florence and Normandy, right? That when we begin to tell the stories about what has happened to our communities, The flashpoint was not on the street what happened to Vincent Chin. It had already happened to all of us and over a long period of time. And there's multiple flashpoints, right? That violence is not what we do to each other. Violence is what the state is doing to us. The state does not have a monopoly on legitimized use of violence. And that's a part of what all these uprising discourses are. Somehow we got in the street, we're violent, and now we're going to stop it and figure out a constructive way to fight for change. It's like, nah, we ain't even talking about that. Y'all the ones that's violent and been violent and continue to be violent, and there's not an end to that story yet. And so hopefully that, again, when we retell, okay, what's up with 92, what's up with any of these incidents, that we think about where we choose to begin the story, what we're trying to, who the characters are, what their perspectives are, who we speaking for and from, that we're not speaking in a way that like, well, these are the good people that that bad things happen to, but of course there was a lot of weeds that we're not going to talk about weeds no more. We're not willing to do that. We're not willing to let anybody in our community be put up there as a bad actor as long as there's no end to the war.
Yeah, and I wanted to say too that, you could see that with some of those earlier slides that South Korea was being described as a police state. And I think that it's interesting to note that in that petition, We Charge Genocide, it states that in the United States, that there is a police state that exists that people don't recognize as such. And in fact, that petition states that the modality of lynching has changed. That once it was the lyncher's noose, but now it's a policeman's bullet. At the same time that Truman declares the war in Korea as a police action. And typically people are like, police action, that's a way of deflecting accountability for war. But what if we were to take that term seriously? What if we were to understand U.S. interventions and to understand that U.S. war power and police power go hand in hand? And people tend to think like, okay, South Korea is a democracy, people fought for it, and and they fought against U.S.-backed military dictators, and some form of democracy emerged. And I'm not saying that things haven't changed, but in South Korea to this day, there are approximately 30,000 U.S. military forces. There are about 80 military installations. The United States practices the world's largest war exercises with South Korea, and these simulate a nuclear first strike against North Korea and the decapitation of the North Korean leadership and the occupation of North Korea. And that is, what do we call that? Is that democracy? There is a national security law that allows the South Korean government to arrest anyone who is viewed as being critical of the state, right? So I just, I think that I just would thank Yusef, for having this conversation and opening up this discussion about the unending nature of counterinsurgency and imperialist war. And one of the things that we wanted to do when we were taking the show on the road, like in terms of the teaching initiative, is to be able to engage with different communities. And hopefully, and I wonder if this would be a possibility, if with Yusef and I have talked about this loosely, what if we started to do an archive of counterinsurgent LA? What could we start to tell? Would you like to collaborate with us? And so it's just an open invitation to all of you. And thank you so much, and we'll open up to questions.
So we're 45 minutes behind time, but we can cut down some of our reception time for question and answer. So maybe 15 minutes for question and answer.
Thank you so much, and I just want to follow up on that last point about, not a moment in time, continuation of history. Shout out to Stop LAPD Spying, Matias over there wrote that. But how do we tell circular stories then? How do we tell, there's no beginning, there's no end, it's not what we're doing to each other, it's not a moment. So, yeah, just wondering practice for that.
I mean, so, it's, I was part of that first group, ASCK, that did that first 3-year teaching initiative, and we bound it. Why did we bind it according from 2010 to 2013, like 1950 to 1953? Why the hell did we reproduce that on the level of our teaching initiative? It makes no sense. So how do we not emulate or reproduce that state logic, but how, with regard to this initiative about the unending Korean War, part of it is the temporal question, like someone was saying, there is no end to our teaching initiative, and we will continue to build out, like this conversation will become part of the teaching initiative. It will be enfolded into it. And so I think that part of it is, I think, a narrative question, like how do you understand the temporality of unending war? Part of it is also, part of it's also an organizing question, and so with regard to this project, it is being built out, but it's being built out in these conversations. It's a really good question. It's a really good question. I think that, the way that war typically gets narrated is battlefield spectacles. There's a kind of like masculinist war genre that's told by like Army College, like whatever, historians. But that doesn't account for war on the lower frequencies. It doesn't account for other locations that, are also part of the narrative about war. And, I remember with this Korean sociologist who was part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Korea, his name's Kim Dong-chun, and he basically stated at one point, like I asked him, I said, what about sexual violence as absolutely central to the violence, not just of the Korean War as an imperialist war, but also the state formation of South Korea. And I think it's interesting to also realize that not all wars are the same. It's like for North Korea, they were fighting a people's war. And it's very interesting to know that, rape is definitely part and parcel of imperialist warfare. It is not part and parcel of the people's war. And what Kim Dong-chun 선생님 said was, he said, yeah, we didn't ask that question, and it's not been told. And the kind of narratives that come forward are like, if people disclose that, it's an attempt to restore honor, which is so fraught and gendered and problematic and, very heteropatriarchal in many ways. So, like the question of how do you tell the story of unending, permanent war, war on the lower frequencies, everyday war, on intimate registers, etc., it's an open question. It's a question for us all, really.
So, just for us, I think one is to where do we focus our stories? So often it's on the spectacle, right? So it's the burning and the looting and the cops beating of Rodney King and the shootings and this and that. And so how we root our stories in the everyday living and dying and suffering and celebrating this going on. So that's one. Two is like what are we looking at? So like, right, Latasha Harlan's is that liquor store is not the flashpoint of violence against young black women. But also one thing that's interesting when I was looking at it last year is like, that's the same time that Clarence Thomas was being confirmed Supreme Court, and it was, Anita Hill was up in there. And so how do we connect our various stories in ways, right, that are not just this linear, like, this is just what happened to me, and boom, 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 and then this thing, but like this is connecting to a lot of other pieces. The complexity of who we are, so that we're not just telling stories of heroes and villains and Rodney King was, you know, a victim of this and then Gates died, but like we're up on roofs with guns at sometimes, and sometimes we helping people, and sometimes, you know what I mean, like there's a lot of whatever, Walter White get to be both, right? But we don't get to be both, and we don't get to be complex human beings, so that's another one. I think acknowledging the silences and the stories that we shouldn't or can't tell under surveillance, etc., and how do we represent those kinds of silences or things that we don't remember, we've suppressed, that we're not willing to tell, etc. Like how do we tell that in a sense? How do we tell the absences and the silences? And lastly, which I think Fred Moten, Stefano Harney, whatever, and for us understanding ourselves as a fugitive archive, that we are more loyal to freedom than facts. And so we're not invested in history by being like, no, that was 1951 instead of 1953. Like, we're not really worried about that, but we're worried about like, oh, what did they do when they charged genocide against the United States for genocide to black people? And how can we carry that forward? But I don't really care if it was 1951 or 1953, how much William Patterson wrote or didn't write or whatever, right? And so I think a lot of times we're telling these linear stories because we're trying to get it right. Somewhere in our mind, we think that somehow if we can get enough evidence out the archive to prove that we are human beings and prove that this should no longer happen to us, that we need evidence to marshal. And there's no evidence that's gonna end the war. They're not waiting on us to prove that we human beings for them to stop doing what they're doing. So that I'm not worried about facts then. I'm not worried about evidence. This brother actually just like 2 days ago at the library, he gets his mail there, and he was talking about when he goes to get social services, for him to get better treatment, he tells them he can't read. Because then they have to bring someone out, they got to give him extra help. So like, even what we tell people, so if you do an oral history with his brother, he's going to tell you things that aren't true, but then what we do is like archives and nonprofit go like, oh, this is the real community story, right? It's not. And so it's just to say that our stories are already circular, nonlinear, all these variety of things, right? They deal with intersectionality, whether we like to think so or not. And so that's how we try to approach the work.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing so that what I just said earlier also isn't misunderstood. So, you know, when I was saying that North Koreans and Chinese were fighting a people's war, there was intense political education. And, you know, the sense of guerrilla warfare is that the guerrilla is to the people as a fish is to water. And you don't wage a campaign of sexual terrorism against the people that you are from, right? But by contrast, what is the nature of an imperialist war? It is invasion. Unless you have your local fixers that can explain what's going on, you are not from there. And in fact, when US soldiers were deployed to Korea, they didn't even know where the hell Korea was. And they received, because it was the golden age of comics, they received a comic-style pamphlet, and the pamphlet's title was, "What We Are Doing Here." That is the degree of incomprehension about what the purpose of that imperialist war was. And there was no sense of, I think that some of the research that's so interesting, Crystal Beck and I were just speaking about this earlier, people talk about the comfort woman and the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II, and they understand that this was a system of militarized sexual slavery. The term that was used in Japan was ianfu. The Korean term was wianfu for the Korean women who were forced into the system. People don't realize that in South Korean state documents over the jointly administered US and South Korean system of militarized prostitution, that the term that was used was wianbu. So you could say that there's Japan's comfort woman, there's US comfort woman. And to understand that that is part of an imperialist continuum.
Thank you. I just wanted to start by saying thank you for the framing of counterinsurgency. Just because I've been realizing over the past several years, so I was 1 years old when 1992 happened in LA, and this was way before Crazy Rich Asians, and this was way before Minari and Sandra Oh and all this stuff, right? And Margaret Cho was having a mental health crisis, and there was no such thing as Asian visibility. And we've seen such a huge outpouring of, like, particularly Korean, I think, emphasis in media. And I've been fucking freaking out. I'm like, where did this come from? We need to stay vigilant. The FBI's gonna come and kill us all tomorrow. We're not gonna be prepared. And I think that's the feeling that I've been having of just like, oh, folks are not being mindful of how our rhetoric is changing. And what you were saying about we didn't see being replicated in community efforts now, it's so striking to me, but it makes sense, right? Because since all of this happened and today, 9/11 has happened, and so has all of the ramping up of the wars in the Middle East. And I think it's very poignant that we're talking about this now as we're also commemorating a significant anniversary of the Iraq War. But I just wanted to say thank you for that. And I'm listening to the news, right, about all of these foreign policy tensions with China and thinking about how also this is going to implicate me as like a Korean person who's thinking about my place in diaspora and as I walk through the world. But the question at the end of this is, like, all of this makes sense too because I think folks who are on the quote-unquote left and folks who are critical still talk about our economic system as if we're just talking about neoliberalism. When neoliberalism was a word that was coined like before the 80s, right? Like, we're not keeping up with the people who are actually in power. And I always say there's not going to be an end to the Korean War until we end capitalism. So I just wanted to, and I also don't believe that people who are in this country will ever be free until the end of capitalism. So I just wanted to ask for your thoughts on that because yes, there's a police state, yes, there's war, but I think maybe it's a chicken or egg question, but the umbrella term to all of these things for me is the big C capitalism. So I just wanted to ask that question.
I mean, that is where there is a kind of clarity to some of the materials in the Southern California Library. Like you see, it says, you know, it's an anti-capitalist critique of the Korean War. What's the purpose of this? You know, what is the purpose of this intervention? You know, it is, you know, for corporate profits and economic control and, you know, political control. And, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned, well, I would just mention, like, in terms of this sort of Korean wave that has extended to Korean Americans too, it's interesting to see how, you know, Sandra Oh, a number of years ago, was part of a Korean American coalition campaign that was called, what was it called? Think, Topple Hunger in North Korea. So she was asked to be a spokesperson, and she and also that guy from Minari, what's his name, the person who was him, yes. They both came out and they said, there are hungry children in, you know, the North Korea-China border, and they are looking for parents, and you should support this bill to topple hunger in North Korea by creating an adoption pathway so that, you know, families in the United States can adopt these children. And I had the opportunity to talk to her about that. She said she didn't even read the bill's legislation. She just took it as a given that North Korea is a site of danger and that somehow the United States is a site of refuge, you know. And it was stunning to me because that bill also authorized the same kind of baby scooping that occurred in the wake of hot fighting for decades in South Korea. But by not recognizing children who were North Korean, who had North Korean mothers and Chinese fathers as having Chinese nationality, but instead stating that they were stateless and could be scooped. You know, so yeah, it's not answering your question directly. I agree with you. You know, I think that this, and Yusef was saying that we have to have an analysis of racial capitalism and thinking about domestic counterinsurgency and imperialist counterinsurgency abroad. But I also think like the cultural element is so interesting because of a kind of heliotropic orientation towards South Korea that exists in the Korean diaspora in the States. And that inflects, culture as well.
Part of us sitting here now having this conversation is the beauty of capitalism, that it can hold that, it can fund it. I don't know who funded y'all, right? Like, it's also now, this is a moment of the violence of inclusion, right? Where we're all represented, and now everyone, the mother has an archive, and there's a lot of funding for archives like us that no one cared about these histories before, but now it's like, we can trade this in for grants from the Mellon and et cetera, right? Very nice room, it's a little cold, but like, good facilities, right? But like that we're not like worried about coming in and someone and shooting us right now, and we're essentially paid under capitalism to have this conversation in ways in which it's really hard to be an outside of that, right? Like what do you do? The Oscars now is, instead of like racism is because you didn't give me an Oscar. It's not that the Oscars themselves is an articulation of capitalism and racism, right? It's that somehow you didn't give it to me, and when you give it to me, I start crying, right? And a lot of our efforts have been around representation rather than redistribution. And that's, so I don't know what the question is, but essentially I think we're in agreement that if we're not dealing with racial capitalism and the violences that it requires, we're not gonna get very far. But it's also, particularly in the US context, like it's just very difficult to figure out like how do you get an outside, and then you find out even a lot of scholars, and I wasn't picking on nobody who went to Yale when I said it earlier, like all our loved ones in all these places. But there's scholars who will write about Black death and racial capitalism, and then they get a grant award, and they crying. Because they got, like literally, I could say names, but it's like, yo, like your whole work has helped me understand what this is. But when they say, oh, you smart, then now I feel seen, right? And so part of even that in terms of us as people is like interrogating our structures of desire. What is it that we really want? Do we really want an end to capitalism, right? Or do we want to be just as able to be capitalized as everybody else, right? Like I want to be rich too. I want an Oscar. I want, whatever MacArthur Genius Grant and da-da-da-da-da, right? Like I want all these goodies, but I can still get to say that like, like racism is a bad thing and da-da-da-da-da, but like really at the end of the day, you'd be surprised that's really what so much of what we really want. And that's human, like that's not, that doesn't make us bad people, but if we're not really gonna deal with the fact that we just wanna get put on too,
Maybe we can take one more question.
Thank you so much. I don't know if anybody wants to go. Thank you so much for being here. I feel like I learned a lot. I'm having a hard time and struggling with like how I feel disconnected to older Korean generation to when we talk about fight. Like I feel like it's because there's so much emotional aspect to it, but I also want to have open conversations with my parents. Are not here, but whenever I have a desire to want to have deeper conversation about it, but it's almost like I get faced with like, you weren't there, you were naive, you don't know much, and I feel like I want to find a way to connect, disconnect, to understand ourselves better, but I don't even know how to start, and I don't even know how to like, I guess start conversation without heavy-handed academic language, or for folks who doesn't have the accessible language to explain this for type of events. Because I just want to be practically have a conversation, but it gets like really overwhelming. So if you have any suggestions or like advice to kind of start off, I would really appreciate it.
So, do you want?
Go ahead.
This isn't, I don't know your people, so right, like you know your people and what it actually looks like. But a couple things that I would say is like, think about how we have conversation. So if you're not really gonna say nothing right now, then we can just sit here. You know what I mean? Like, we've had people in the neighborhood, like their child just got killed. They come to the library and we just sit on the street. Like we don't gotta say nothing. Later there might be words, But they gonna say like, you naive, you this, you that, because you know there's pain. They don't want to talk about it, so just sit. And then on top of that, then how do you listen when you're sitting? Because just like I said, that brother said like, oh, when I go, I tell them I can't read. We could spend another whole session telling stories about like people who think this and it's really the other, and things that we tell each other to be safe and do this and do that. So you have to listen around what someone is verbally saying, right? Does that make, you know what I'm saying? Like you can't just take what I'm like verbally. You got to be like, well, who is this person? Like if you ask people in our neighborhood, like, oh, what do we do about all this, harm that's happening? The person that's been locked up in every prison in California will be like, you need to lock all of them up. But when I watch her during the day, like that's not how she really thinks. Because I see her taking care of people, I see her not judging people, you know what I mean? I see all the ways in which she moves that's anti-police. But if you ask her, especially in this room where she think we're all from a university, she's gonna say like, oh, we need more prisons and police, but that's not how she's living. So it's the other part is how you listen. And then in terms of the practical piece, what I was trying to do, what I would say is just ask questions, right? So to me, we asked people in the hood, like these were young men, and we were actually using the archive of We Charge Genocide to look at what kind of project we do, but a lot of them were so-called gangs, whatever. And this was at the height of BLM and other stuff, and we said, would you rather the police officer get locked up, or would you rather have better housing? It's kind of a setup, but I'm saying like that's a question. I didn't tell you, like I'm not trying to throw some academic language. I said like I want housing. They ain't worried about what happened to the cop. They need some money. They want to go to Red Lobster on a date. Like literally, they want deodorant so they smell. But like that's the things that they was telling us. So you don't have to have an academic conversation, but like how can you ask more empathetic and loving questions, knowing that what they're going to tell you is that reactionary thing. But look at how they live.
It's a hard question to address. I'll just say very briefly, let alone Saigu, talking about the war. And, my parents were youth during the war, and no way, no how was I able to speak to them in any depth about their experience because it was that painful. And, but you could see it in certain things. And so both of my parents passed in recent years. But I remember I live up in Santa Cruz, and my parents came up to visit me. And we went to this park, and there are redwoods, and there are all these low fences that demarcate the path. And my mom has always been this way. But she just crossed over the barrier. And you're not supposed to, She crossed over the barrier, and then she grabbed something, and she brought it back to me. She pressed my hand, and it was a bunch of mushrooms, really thin, long mushrooms. She said, "This is really good eating," and it's because she wildcrafted. I would never. To me, I could never have a conversation with my mom about her experience in the war, but that to me conveys something, and. It's not to romanticize it, but it's to understand that their story is so intimately wound up with profound suffering, And they would not take a stance like me, no.
Before we wrap up, I actually want to respond to that.
Yeah.
And with regards to our module, I'm just chiming in with this idea of alternative archive. What's alternative to state and national archive, which are militarized, right? I want to emphasize that our modules specifically focus on kind of diversifying the kind of materials that you can use. So, for instance, like our Vietnam War module, if you look, there's literature, there's short stories, there's documentaries, film clips. And so, for me personally, my dad used to do textile business in Vietnam. And so instead of kind of putting on this historian mode of, these are new facts that I encountered about your time, I bring up, for instance, the novella by Tang Yan-seok called Lobster Eating Time. And it's this weird, uncanny story about how the Korean capitalists in Vietnam, right, and how that kind of awkward lobster eating time to get together with a Vietnam worker. So actually the Vietnamese worker is a relative family member of a past victim of Korean War atrocities that were inflicted, but this kind of weird space of warring from Korean participation in the Vietnam War transforms into their kind of joint struggle against capitalism that's both inseeped in them, right? So I mean, this kind of opens up so much conversation with my dad, for instance, because I was like, there might have been people, because we have family members who, like my dad's brother was a Marine, Korean Marine, Vietnam War veteran, right? But like when we kind of use cultural products, cultural texts, it can kind of bring out conversations that are not offensive because we're not directly saying that it's what you did that's wrong, but it can kind of tease out the different violences. So I've really found that kind of exercise really useful. I mean, but everybody has different contexts in their own family, right? But some of the ways that we're kind of talking about, the ways in which you could use this syllabus, it's not just kind of we go out there and teach, but you could kind of use it within intimate spaces of your family, relatives, and etc. So that's what we're doing. We will, on that note, before we start our reception, why don't we give a round of applause for